The three stages of life: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. For Kierkegaard, the aesthetic stage is where we find ourselves focused on constantly chasing pleasures in order to make our lives meaningful. You can think of this stage as sort of a psychological hedonism or eroticism. In this stage, life revolves around quick highs: sex, casual relationships, porn, money, experimenting with drugs, partying, looking for that job promotion, social media, exploring different personas, and various other outlets of fleeting pleasures. There is, in essence, a general preoccupation with making life as interesting as possible. In this stage, there typically lacks a moral foundation, and instead the individual's foundation rests upon a sole concern for themselves and incessantly searching for pleasure. Although this stage may sound appealing, and it surely can be for some, it nevertheless gradually eats the individual alive and slowly disintegrates them. Like someone addicted to drugs, the first time is exhilarating, but as time goes on and repetition sinks in, the drug addict becomes a slave to his or her addiction. The same can be said for the individual who is submerged in the aesthetic life. According to Kierkegaard, this stage ultimately leads to despair, boredom, and meaninglessness. All of these pleasures are temporary and require more and more in order to sustain them, or sustain the high. Thus, the individual becomes empty in moments when there is no pleasure, and this eventually leads to a kind of nihilistic surrender. I do not feel like doing anything. I do not feel like riding. The motion is too powerful. I do not feel like walking. It is too tiring. I do not feel like lying down, for either I would have to stay down, and I do not feel like doing that, or I'd have to get up again, and I do not feel like doing that either. Summa summarum, I do not feel like doing anything. So in this stage, the individual never really becomes a self. He or she is divorced from oneself, plunged in the depths of mediocrity, dreary routine, and a general fixation on getting the next high. There is no progress or development. One remains stagnant, devoid of any serious meaning, drowning day after day in the search for more finite pleasures. Kierkegaard tells us that the aesthetic life will always amount to despair, whether one is aware of it or not. Some individuals, unfortunately, will remain in this stage for the rest of their lives, only ever touching the ethical stage, as we shall explore next. Once one has become aware of their despair in the aesthetic life, one seeks to graduate to a more fulfilling state of life. In the ethical stage, the individual is now concerned with serving others. He or she feels a sense of duty or social obligation, and in general, seeks to have a more moral foundation and more concrete life projects. So now, since the aesthetic pleasures have proved to be meaningless, one seeks to become a part of something bigger. This is where we may see individuals beginning to participate in their community, joining clubs, volunteer work, latching onto political parties, caring about social justice, and so on. Moreover, at this point, serious relationships and children may become of interest to the ethical self. Marriage creates a union, and two become one. This gives the ethical self tremendous meaning and something to truly live for. The ethical life, for the first time, brings one to the level of self-worth. And there is a consistency of character. They have entered the realm of good and bad. Or what ought I do? The ethical self may ask. But the problem with this stage is that the individual still remains in despair. The ethical self may do good things and be engaged in something greater than themselves, but he or she has no ultimate foundation of why they do the good. Moreover, in this stage, does one really ever become a self? The aesthetic and the ethical self ultimately have no relation to anything beyond the finite. There are still limitations within this stage, and moreover, the ethical self is predicating their very being on social norms, customs, and convictions, which of course are imperfect in many ways. There is also a risk that the individual may become hypnotized by the state, making the state his god. At this point, the individual looks to rise beyond everything finite and temporal. The individual looks to graduate to something everlasting. The final stage, which is the most important stage of life according to Kierkegaard, is the religious stage. In this stage, the individual seeks a transcendent point of reference, namely God. In doing so, the individual comes to realize that they are involved in a cosmic participation of something infinitely larger than themselves. Coming to this realization, the individual begins to abandon everything worldly. He or she enters into a completely different mode of being. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. This new mode of being involves, as I have said, denying the temporal and affirming the eternal. One must not look backwards, bothered by worldly things that are destined to disappear. Instead, one moves forward and cultivates faith in that which transcends everything of this world. For Kierkegaard, the religious stage is about the subjective passions. It is not about conventional church dogma. There is a reason Kierkegaard once said, "The crowd is untruth." In other words, we ourselves are to find God through awe, wonder, passion, excitement, curiosity, and desire. It's an inward journey. However, since one cannot absolutely prove that God exists, one must, as Kierkegaard said, take a leap of faith. But this leap of faith involves embracing something utterly profound, something that cannot be reduced to words. Maximus the Confessor, for instance, once said that knowing God is like rushing into a pure embrace beyond all words and concepts. To put it another way, one can think of the love he has for his wife. When in love, the experience cannot really be reduced to words. It is an intimate union, an understanding that transcends rational thought and language altogether. So in the religious stage of life, the individual finally becomes a self. They become fully actualized. One is pulled towards eternity and falls in love with the eternal wellspring of all that is, God. Human beings have a propensity for that of the infinite. Eternity almost demands our attention and yearns for us to join it. The individual, according to Kierkegaard, is within the world, but at the same time is not a part of the world. He or she is one with God. Ultimately, this stage is the cure for nihilistic despair. At last, the individual is free, predicating his or her life on something everlasting, and therefore has reached the highest state of existence.